to my knowledge, there are no photographs of any lynchings. I think there's a reason for that, because if somebody took a photograph, it would show that they were there. And there were always investigations into the lynchings, and no one ever spoke up and said, well, yeah, I was there, and so was John and Harry and George and Tom. Nobody ever did that, because their own life would have been in danger had they done something like that. And yet sometimes it was the most prominent people in the community that were doing these things. It wasn't just your ignorant backwoods person that had no education. It was sometimes, but some of the people were community leaders. So that's just really unfortunate. And in one case, which is in my book, somebody in the newspaper wrote that the sheriff was there. And if the sheriff was there, why didn't he just arrest the man and have a trial? But that's not how it happened. They lynched him. And according to the newspaper, the sheriff was there. It's hard to believe. That's hard for me to believe, but it's what it said. Anyway, sometimes when I talk about lynchings, I bring a noose. And I hold it out, and I ask for volunteers. I don't tell them what they're volunteering for. I just say, I need a volunteer. And everybody just sort of looks and hesitates. And sooner or later, somebody will come up thinking, this is nothing. And I give them some papers to hand out or something. But it was kind of fun whenever I did that. I didn't do that to you today because I don't have any papers to hand out. But first I want to tell you that all lynchings are hangings, but not all hangings are lynchings. I'm sure somebody can tell me the difference. Yes?
Well, there'd be some kind of legal process in the one, and the other is just mob rule.
Right, exactly. A hanging is the outcome of a legal process involving a judge and a jury. A lynching is an execution by hanging, usually the result of mob violence. Lynchings are extrajudicial killings. I like that word. I had to look that up. I mean, I knew what it meant, but I had to look it up to be sure it fit my sentence, and it does. Extrajudicial killings, meaning they occur without the benefit of a trial. However, in Franklin County, no perpetrators of lynchings have ever been prosecuted to my knowledge, and I've been reading this stuff and researching it for 35 years. Can anybody guess why? Why no one is ever prosecuted?
Nobody talks about it.
I think I just gave you the answer a while ago. Nobody would talk about it. Nobody. I mean, there could be 100 people there, and nobody would talk about it. So they never found out. When they had an investigation, they didn't learn anything. And not only that, if they went to the jail to pull the victim out to go hang him, and they were gonna, maybe hold a gun up to the sheriff or the jailer or whatever, that person always pretended, or perhaps some of them were for real, but they pretended that to just, say, no, you can't take him, and try to keep him from it, but then they'd hand him the keys or whatever they needed to do. So it was often the jailer was sympathetic to their cause, and if not sympathetic to their cause, afraid of them. So the biggest difference in collecting the history of lynchings and hangings in Franklin County is that we probably know about all the legal hangings. I believe we do. I have them all in my book. All the legal hangings that have taken place here, but it's entirely likely that lynchings took place in the early days that we have no record of and don't know about. I can't imagine that that wouldn't be the truth, but I've collected all of them I could possibly pull together for this book. Anyway, there's only 2 on my list that I've learned about in the last 10 years. I mean, 35 years I've been doing this, and here these show up, you know. But my presentation tonight features one of those. It's a story that's not widely known and was not reported in the Goodspeed history or any other area history. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the lynching of Joe Howard and the convoluted series of connected crimes that didn't come to light until after he was lynched. So I don't think they could have lynched him 2 or 3 times if they'd known about the rest of it, but anyway. During the summer and fall of 1873, farmers who lived south and west of Pacific were complaining because their cattle and their horses were being stolen. In fact, most of the animals were boldly taken from their home pasture, just in the middle of the day. And this kept going on. The farmers were strongly suspicious of certain parties, but had failed to obtain enough proof to justify their arrest or expect a conviction. A vigilance committee, to me I think vigilante is probably a better word, but the newspapers called it a vigilance committee, had been organized with the intention of making an example of the culprit or culprits when and if they were caught. 2 mules had been stolen from a Mrs. North at Gray Summit. Somebody's going to ask me which Mrs. North, and I don't know. So, but there were several. A somewhat confusing newspaper account reported that she had paid a $300 reward for their return. And this mule thief was reported to have been captured, and unfortunately, the story did not identify the suspect, so I don't know who it was that was captured. The state had gone to great expense to convict the thief, but he had escaped from their custody and continued to steal from local people. Maybe this was Joe Howard. Maybe it wasn't, you know. But in June of 1873, someone stole a horse from George Huffsmith of Pacific. In an effort to learn what happened to his horse, Huffsmith notified the police in St. Louis and other communities. In a few days, he learned that a horse matching the description of his missing steed had been found in St. Louis. He went to the city and confirmed that it was indeed his horse. Joe Howard, a man well known but not exactly well thought of in Pacific, had been arrested for taking the horse. The St. Louis Police Department sent a telegram to Pacific advising officials that the accused man, Joe Howard, was being returned to Pacific by train and that they needed to have the calaboose ready. I'm sure somebody can tell me what a calaboose was.
Jail.
How many of you know the answer to that? Okay, a jail. That's what they call the jails back in those days, the calaboose. I'm not sure the origin of the word, where it came from, but that was the typical word that they used. Realizing the prisoner was probably the same man who had been stealing horses and cattle in the area over the past several months, someone notified the Vigilance Committee. An unidentified person on the Vigilance Committee decided to make a Paul Revere-style ride to alert the countryside of Howard's upcoming arrival. I don't think they were going to have a parade, do you? Well, they sort of did. The newspaper reported he had jumped in his saddle and maneuvered his noble steed with panting breath and distended nostrils, galloping from farm to farm and house to house, notifying farmers in the region of Howard's expected arrival. An unusual number of men gathered on the streets of Pacific by evening before the train was supposed to arrive. Many of them were on horseback. It was whispered around town that the men were here to hang Joe Howard. By the time the evening express train was due to arrive in Pacific, the train Joe Howard was coming in on, a crowd had gathered around the depot platform. The steam engine chugged into the station that evening in June 1873 with the doomed man on board. Joe Howard stepped down from the train. He was escorted to the calaboose by Pacific Marshal John D. Miller, along with several officers who had accompanied the prisoner from St. Louis. The men in the crowd followed, but they didn't do anything because Howard was being kept under heavy guard. About midnight, a detachment went to the jail and demanded to be let in. Pacific City Marshal John D. Miller refused to give up the keys at first, but eventually yielded to the mob's repeated threats. Now, they didn't do anything to him. They didn't hurt him, but he either agreed with what they were doing or was afraid of them, and I don't know which it was. So if you're a descendant of John D. Miller, I'm not saying that he did this on purpose, but I'm saying it's a possibility. Whether Marshal Miller was genuinely opposed to Howard being forcibly taken from the jail or just putting on a show of legitimate protest will never be known. If Miller recognized anybody in the mob, as with all the other lynchings that I've learned about, he apparently didn't identify them, nor did anyone else. I'm sure it would not have gone well for him if he had said who they were. But I don't see how he could help but know, because it's a small community, and even if they had their faces covered, and I don't know that they did, they likely did, you recognize voices of your neighbors and friends and people who live around you, at least to some extent. Howard was then taken outside the city limits of Pacific. His captors threatened to string him up if he didn't confess. When he hesitated, they placed a rope around his neck and proceeded to hang him. After they believed he had sufficiently strangled to make the point, he was taken down. He made a full confession, implicating himself and others. What others? Who's going to tell? They'd be saying, I was there, if they knew. If you were there watching that hanging and the guy confessed and said, yeah, it was Harry and John and Carl or whatever, they would say, well, how do you know? And that would mean you were there, you were part of the mob, and you were guilty. So it was not in the paper. I didn't find out what he said in the confession. Anyway, he made a full confession implicating himself and others in the recent epidemic of livestock thievery. Joe Howard was returned to his jail cell in the calaboose, and the detachment of men dispersed. Well, you came here tonight to hear the story of a lynching, didn't you? That's okay, I won't disappoint you. That's not the end of the story. Apparently not pleased that Howard might live to see the light of another day, another lynch mob, another mob-style detachment appeared at the jail after Howard was just getting comfy back in his cell. They also demanded that Howard be released to them. Marshall Miller was again compelled to yield to their demands. Howard was then again hurried away under cover of darkness. The second group of vigilantes put a rope around Joe Howard's neck and led him down Old Gray Summit Road to a spot about 4 miles southwest of Pacific. Joe Howard was hanged on a tree near the bridge over Brush Creek. By the way, the reason I don't have a PowerPoint is because there really aren't any pictures. I do have a map, I didn't bring it because I wasn't doing a PowerPoint, that shows about where that hanging took place. But that's really all I could have given you because there are no photographs of any of this, so we can't show you anything. He was hanged on a tree near the bridge over Brush Creek. The following morning, apparently inspired by morbid curiosity, many people traveled by foot, horseback, or a wagon from Pacific, Gray Summit, and nearby farms to see Joe Howard's lifeless body dangling from a tree. Now, if this sounds kind of morbid to you and like something you wouldn't do, hopefully we have enough humaneness about us now that we wouldn't, but I'm not so sure of that. Keep in mind that back in those days, people paid to witness public hangings. In fact, tickets were sold to the legal hangings in Union. And anyone who wanted to attend could buy one. I've forgotten which hanging it was, but Margie Duckworth in St. Clair was the only woman to attend one of them. And she had a ticket, and she took her child, who later became Dr. Duckworth. She took him because he was kind of a little out of control. He was kind of a juvenile delinquent kind of kid. And she took him so he could see what might happen if he didn't change his ways. Well, later when he went to medical school, she got an apartment close by the medical school so she could keep an eye on him. So this mother was going to make sure this kid got through medical school. But anyway, she took him to this public hanging, and she was the only woman there. But it was important to her that her kid know what could happen to him if he went down the wrong path. And actually, he was at one point accused of abortions during an era when, of course, abortion was illegal, but it was never proven. He never served any time. Squire Julius, the coroner, held an inquest, and the verdict was he came to his death by strangulation at the hands of parties unknown to the coroner's jury. Of course, it was always parties unknown. Hamilton Rowan Gamble was provisional governor of Missouri at the time of the hanging. He offered a reward in an attempt to bring justice to Franklin County men who had taken the law into their own hands. Detectives spent several days scouring Franklin County, trying to get information, but they failed to learn who the perpetrators were. So, of course, no one was prosecuted. Okay, I call this part 2. We've got Joe Howard's been hanged already, and the word is hanged, not hung. However, a lot of times it is written as hung. Amazingly, accounts of the murder of a child that had taken place in Jefferson County about 14 months earlier provided additional information about Joe Howard. The person found to be responsible for the murder was Mrs. Rosabelle Rebecca Eads, and the child was her adopted son, Lewis Merrill Taylor, age 6. Did you all find this in your research? No? Oh my. She was reported by news sources to have been, and based on some ancestry pages, probably was, the widow of Captain William Eads, whose river boats once plied the waters of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. A family ancestry page stated that her husband, Captain Eads, was a cousin to James Buchanan Eads. Can somebody tell me who James Buchanan Eads was? He's the Eads that designed the Eads Bridge. So, his cousin is a riverboat captain, and this all kind of fits. It was all the same era. It's probably true. I just can't state it as absolute. I'm going to digress here. You might think I'm going off on a tangent, but this all ties in. I want to give you a little background about Captain Eads, who died prior to the events involving Joe Howard, and Eads' third wife, Rosabelle Rebecca Eads, who murdered her young stepson. Captain William Eads was born in Virginia in 1810, where the family had a 1,000-acre farm. He married Frances, they called her Fanny, Frances Hill Cruz, in 1830. Their first child, James Edgar Eads, was born in 1831. William had left Fanny in Virginia and came to St. Louis, where he went to work as a pilot on a steamboat and later earned certification to become a steamboat captain. Reportedly, he was also a good fiddler and loved to dance. His mother-in-law in Virginia did not approve of such goings on. He returned when his son was 2 and wanted to bring Fanny and young James back to St. Louis. Fanny's mother persuaded her to stay in Virginia. There's no record of a divorce, but he then changed his name to EDDS, from Eads, like Eads Bridge, to EDDS, perhaps to avoid a charge of bigamy. We don't know. That might have been the reason, and it might not. There's something later in this story that you'll hear in a minute that makes me kind of think that might not have been it, but I don't know. Eads went on to have a remarkable career as a riverboat captain. He once owned a number of steamers, including the Eliza Stewart, the Oregon, Robert Campbell, Prairie Rose, T.C. Twitchell, and later served as the master of the steamer New Lucy, which was known to be the best floating palace and fastest boat on the Missouri River. In the late 1850s, his son, James Edgar Eads, came from Virginia to visit him, and he got to take a ride on the William Campbell with his dad. And that's why that I kind of wonder about that, because his wife, ex-wife, whatever she was, she surely knew where he was of her son, and I don't know how old he was. If her son was coming to visit him, she surely knew where he was. The son knew, so I don't know why the name was changed. That reason doesn't quite add up. His son returned to Virginia and subsequently changed his surname to EDDS because he wanted to have the same name as his father. And whenever you read the Find a Grave pages on this family, some of them are EADS, some of them are EDDS, and some of them are EADES, all on the same Find a Grave pages. And we're talking about children in the same family, and it's just really kind of strange. During the Civil War, as a civilian, Eads piloted his steamers, Augustus McDowell Latan, or Latan, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it, and Prairie Rose. He piloted those steamers because they had all been pressed into service as federal transports for the duration of the war. So he was doing these runs on the river that were dangerous for the federal government, for the North. He married again, a second time, in 1834 to Margaret Morin, M-O-R-I-N. They had 3 daughters, Sarah, Mary, and Margaret. His second wife died in April of 1858. The following September, his wife died in April. He gets married again in September. Well, he married Rosabelle Bell, they called her Bell, Rebecca Eldridge. Rosabelle Rebecca Eldridge. He was 48, she was 27. He died in August of 1866, 8 years after their marriage, and was buried in, is it Bellefontaine or Bellefountain? It's Bellefountain, like Bellefountain Neighbors?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, he's buried in the Bellefountain Cemetery. Now, to get back to Rosabelle, see, this is going all over. Rosabelle's the one who murdered the child. Rosabelle was Ede's 3rd wife. Okay, Rosabelle was born in Ohio in 1829, the daughter of John and Drusilla Merrifield, and of course Eldridge. According to an ancestry poster, Rosabelle married 4 times. She first married John Wesley Freeland Jr. in Platte County, Missouri, where her family had settled. Then she married William Eads in 1858. She next married Julius Levens, or Sevens. There was, it's a question, I'm not sure which surname is correct. On March 1 of 1867. Then she lived with Joe Howard. Okay, like I said, this is convoluted. It's just all over the place. But apparently she did not marry him. One ancestry poster had her down as married to him, but had no dates or anything, and I don't think they knew what they were talking about. Her next marriage, which will be mentioned later, was to Frank Boltinghouse in 1875. Okay, now we return to the murder. It was reported to have occurred on April 1 of 1872. At the time, Mrs. Eads was living on a farm in northern Jefferson County with a hired man, Joe Howard. Also in the home was Charles Eads, a young man Mrs. Eads had raised and apparently given her surname to. This Charles Eads was not the son of Captain Eads. She just gave her surname to him. Apparently she liked to adopt children. So anyway, she had adopted Charles and named him Eads. I don't know what his original name was. And she also adopted 2 of the children of George Washington Taylor and Nancy Jane Garrison Taylor. And they were Lewis Merrill Taylor, age 6, and his sister Mary Josephine Taylor, age 13. For some reason, she didn't put Eads on their name. They kept their original names. By all accounts, Mrs. Eads was very abusive to the Taylor children. No, they're 6 and 13. But she would cuff them about, smack them around. One day, 2 or 3 eggs were missing. And she accused young Lewis, who was only 6 years old, of taking them. He denied having done so and told Mrs. Eads the dog did it, which is probably true. Dogs do that. My dog wouldn't, but well, I don't think he would. Who knows? But not believing the boy, Mrs. Eads became enraged. She picked up an axe handle and struck him over the head. He immediately fell to the floor, dead. 6-year-old boy, for stealing 2 or 3 eggs that he probably didn't even steal. Lewis's sister, 13-year-old Mary Josephine Taylor, had been churning butter in the next room, but had seen the killing. She ran away and hid. She was found and threatened with instant death if she ever told anyone. There's 2 versions of the story as to what happened to Mary Josephine. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that she was sent to live with her Uncle Eldridge, who lived 3 miles northwest of Camden Point in Platte County. I don't think I've ever been in Platte County. Let's see. The record, and I don't know for sure if that's a St. Louis record. I think they had one, or the Union record, told a different and more plausible story. When you think about it, well, let me go ahead with this. Not wanting to kill Mary Josephine, Mrs. Eads came up with the idea of taking her into a deep wooded area far away and leaving her to starve to death. Now this is back when it was frontier days. I mean, it was 1870, what did I say, 76, something like that. 1872. I mean, it was still, to me, it was still pretty primitive, and there was a lot of woods in Missouri. And anyway, she wanted to just take her out and let her starve to death. So Eads, and that's the son she adopted, and Howard, who is our Joe Howard, put the child on a bareback mule and took her 40 miles from the scene of the murder and left her in the woods far from civilization. In the meantime, Mrs. Eads left her farm home and disappeared. We'll hear from her again. I know, it's hard to follow all of this, isn't it? After much suffering, Mary Josephine found her way to a house, but because she feared for her life, she did not tell the whole story. She asked for help, telling the people she wanted to go to the home of her Uncle Eldridge. She wanted to go to the home of her Uncle Eldridge, who lived in Platte County, Missouri. Arrangements were made for her to go to her uncle's house. The plot thickens. Her Uncle Eldridge had no respect for Mrs. Eads. Now that sentence right there, if her Uncle Eldridge had no respect for Mrs. Eads, I do not believe that Rebecca wanted her to go to his house. I think she wanted her to go out in the woods and starve to death, because she would have known, because she had had previous problems with her, with this Uncle Eldridge, the brother to her mother. The brother to Isabel, Rosabelle Rebecca. It was Rosabelle Rebecca's brother, and she'd had trouble with him before, and she would not have sent this child deliberately to his house. But anyway, her Uncle Eldridge had no respect for Mrs. Eads, because she had been caught in a conspiracy to have her parents done away with the intention of getting her hands on their fortune. I hope you're really paying close attention, because if you're not, you're probably really lost. But I think everybody's paying attention. Mary Josephine opened up to her uncle and told him everything. Both Mary Josephine and her uncle kept their own counsel until the day young Mary Josephine spotted Charles Eads in Platte County. She told her story to the authorities, and Eads was soon arrested. Her uncle believed Eads had come to Platte County with the intention to do him harm, and I doubt very much that Charles knew that the child was there. While he was in jail, Charles Eads wrote a letter to Mrs. Rebecca Boltinghouse, 2620 Papin Street, St. Louis, Missouri. Platte County Sheriff was kind of on the ball. He at once suspected that Mrs. Eads might be posing as Rebecca Boltinghouse. He contacted the St. Louis Chief of Police, Lawrence, who went by Larry, Lawrence Harrigan, who determined that the sheriff's suspicions were right. Mrs. Eads, age 40 plus, had been living as the mistress of Frank Boltinghouse, a 24-year-old brakeman on the Missouri Pacific Railroad. So, I mean, there's a huge difference in their age. Well, Mrs. Eads was arrested. Here she finally is getting arrested. Frank Boltinghouse came to the jail to see her, and they had a good cry together. They decided to get married. She's in jail. They decided to get married, and the ceremony was performed in the police captain's office. Mrs. Eads, who had been living with Boltinghouse since November of 1874, was expecting a baby. I mean, this just goes on and on, I'm telling you. She was described as 40 years old, but well-preserved and good-looking, and does not look at all like the great criminal she is alleged to be. So criminals are supposed to look bad. Many other crimes were charged against her, including that in 1871 she conspired to have both of her parents assassinated in order to get their property. Reportedly, her murderous plan was only frustrated when her father discovered it accidentally. So, knowing that story, you know that Mrs. Eads did not want that girl to go to her uncle's house. So I completely disregard the Post-Dispatch story that they wrote at the time. A change of venue took, let's see, where am I? I think I lost something here. Okay, Both Mrs. Eads Boltinghouse and Charles Eads were jailed in Union for a while because an affidavit wrongly alleged that the crime had taken place in Franklin County. This confusion came about because the Eads home was near the Franklin County line, but it actually had taken place in Jefferson County. The two of them were eventually sent to Potosi for trial. She was charged with killing her adopted son. Eads was charged with assisting her to conceal the body. A change of venue took the case to St. Francis County, where she was found guilty of murder in the second degree and sentenced to 20 years in the penitentiary. Due to a defect in the count on which she was tried, the judgment was overturned and both Boltinghouse and Eads were remanded back to Jefferson County to wait for the grand jury to act on the case. Sounds like today, doesn't it? Back then, most murder cases went through fast. This one didn't. During the January 1877 term, Mrs. Boltinghouse was again indicted, but Charles Eads was released. A second change of venue resulted in the murder trial being moved to Iron County, where she was tried and found guilty of murder in the second degree. She was sentenced to serve 10 years in the penitentiary, not 20 as the faulty judgment had stated. According to a list of prisoners published in a warden's report, Rose R.B. Boltinghouse, white, born in Ohio, entered the penitentiary on November 23, 1881. In the Jefferson County section of the 1888 Goodspeed history, her complete name is listed as Rosabelle Rebecca Boltinghouse. No information has been found regarding her release from prison or what happened to the child she was expecting. But it is known that she died in January 1900 in Kansas City at age 71. Now for the rest of the story. Now for the rest of the story. Charles Eads became a notorious horse thief, as did Howard, who turned out to be the same Joe Howard who was lynched by an angry mob near Pacific for horse stealing. So Charles Eads was probably in that gang too. Howard fingered his accomplices at the time he was hanged, but no information was provided as to who those accomplices might have been. The people in the lynch mob, even though that first lynch mob didn't complete their mission, had heard Joe Howard's confession and knew who he said his accomplices were, but were probably afraid to tell it because that would have revealed the fact that they were there. And being there, participating in a lynching, it was a crime. Charles Eads was likely one of them, as he was known to have been a horse thief, and they had lived in the same household. Nothing is known about what happened to him, and I have definitely looked. There may be something somewhere, but it has escaped me. The Taylor children that were adopted by Rosabelle Eldridge had several birth family siblings, some younger, some older, some in between them. You know, he was 6, she was 13. There were quite a few children in that household. One of the posters on Ancestry believed that they were probably sold because the family probably was desperate for money. So anyway, that's conjecture as far as I know, that they had anything to back it up. But it's possible. But Mary Josephine Taylor, the sister of the victim, married James Harvey Merle, who lived from 1851 to 1960. They lived in, that's a long time, that's over 100 years, that's 109 years, but you know, it's possible. They lived in Ripley County, Missouri, where they raised 5 children. Hey, we had Ralph Gregory, right? I mean, don't tell me 109 is not possible. But anyway, that's what it said that he lived. That was his lifespan that they gave. And anyway, she had 5 children after that. So I hope she found happiness. She certainly had a traumatic childhood. I later found additional documentation of the Joe Howard story in an 1894 issue of the Pacific Transcript, written 21 years after the lynching took place. The story stated Howard had been lynched in 1871, and I had no reason to doubt that date until I began researching the 1872 Eads Boltinghouse murder case. When I learned that the same Joe Howard was involved in the 1872 murder case, I realized the transcript story was wrong. But the author wrote that many years after it happened. He wrote it from memory, and he got it wrong by a year or two. So any of us can do that sort of thing. An 1875 account of the Boltinghouse story stated Joe Howard had been lynched in June 1873. He could not have been lynched in 1871 because he was a participant in the 1872 Boltinghouse crime. So I will just assume it's safe to use the June 1873 date. That's all you can do, you know, is deduct it. And so this lynching was not reported in the 1888 Goodspeed history, nor was it reported in Ralph Gregory's newspaper article on lynchings, However, both sources included a brief mention of the lynching of a horse thief with the surname of Hopkins living in the Pacific area. And it appeared that both sources were referring to the lynching of Joe Howard, not to Hopkins. However, I can't be absolutely sure. I believe they have too much in common to be a coincidence. Ralph Gregory, who was apparently not aware of the Joe Howard story, included the lynching of Hopkins in his article for leading a gang of horse thieves. And I'll have to tell you, I really hope that's not true about Hopkins. That's my maiden name. And just to kind of summarize this, all but 3 states abolished hanging as a method of execution several years ago. Delaware abolished it in 2016. It's not that long ago, is it? Washington in 2018, state of Washington, and New Hampshire in 2019. Bill Bailey, a convicted murderer who was hanged in 1996, at this point in time, is the last person to have been hanged in the United States, to have been legally hanged. However, there is a Michael Edison in New Hampshire sitting on death row for having murdered a police officer back in 2006, before the law was changed. So he could possibly be hanged if lethal injection is found to be unconstitutional or inefficient, or if Edison chooses hanging. So at this point, Bill Bailey is the last person to be hanged in the United States. It'll probably stay that way, but there's a bit of a chance that Edison could still be hanged yet. So that's pretty well all I have for you. Thank you for your attention.